Well, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. That's where I went to elementary school and high school and into college. Um, I don't remember a great deal about what was happening outside of Memphis. My horizon and my scope and my level of communication with what was happening in the country and the world was very, very limited. And I assume that was on purpose by those who would control information and communication about that. So I wasn't aware of a lot of other things that were going on. I guess I knew about the situation in Little Rock, and well, in '54, he had the Supreme Court decision. And you had some things happening around the country, and so I don't remember a lot of specifics prior to '60, except those things that were national in scope. The bus boycott in '55, '56, and the bombings in various places around the South during that period. You read about them, but you really didn't know a lot. I didn't know a lot about them. Well, fortunately, in Nashville, I was in graduate school, and there was a minister by the name of Reverend Jim Lawson who was teaching at Vanderbilt in the Divinity School. And in the fall of 1959, a number of us had been asked to go to a series of workshops on nonviolent direct action. Quite frankly, I didn't know what that was about. I didn't know. I was more curious as to what was going on than in anything else. But once we got involved with it, we talked about the whole nonviolent technique of direct action and what we hoped would be achieved, by that. And we went through some workshops. We were pushed around and we were thrown on the floor, and just that part of it. Then we had a number of discussions about why we had to think about even moving in that area. This was before the sit-in movement nationally had happened in North Carolina. Just a Nashville group. In that group was uh, Jim Bevel and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and some others that I can't remember now, who had come from Tennessee State, Fisk, the American Baptist Theological Seminary, and there were a couple of people, I guess, from Vanderbilt. Then there were some white students in it who were on exchange from several colleges around the country who were at Fisk, who participated. I think Paul Laprade was one guy I remember. It's been so long trying to remember all these things, but that happened in '59, and that was before February 1st. Well, I think well, actually, it's ironic in the sense we were planning in Nashville to do something ourselves. We didn't know exactly what we were going to do or when we were going to do it or necessarily how in terms of the very specifics. But during this whole fall period, we were talking about doing something. In fact, we were thinking about waiting until the spring to have some kind of action when we had mobilized and had organized ourselves better and expanded outward to larger campuses. Most of the activity was centered at Fisk, which was kind of tough because Fisk is a school where a lot of people send their young people to get an education and to grow up right, proper, not to be talking about demonstrations or other things. But over Tennessee State, it was there were some people who were also interested. So we were interested in maybe doing something in the spring. So when February 1st came and we read about it, and Jim Lawson had some contact with some people in Greensboro, and I guess on that Sunday or Monday right after it happened, he knew a lot about that. And we had a meeting that week, middle of the week, in fact, Tuesday or Wednesday, and we had our major demonstration that next Saturday, which I think thinking about it was probably the 8th or 9th of February. We had, I think, in terms of the overall movement, I mean, I think these things were rather spontaneous to some extent. We were too, except that we had had some preparation in leadership development and in just the whole techniques of organizing people and the whole area of nonviolent direct action. And so when we went in to demonstrate on that Saturday, first of all, it was snowing, yet we were able to muster, I don't know, 300 people because people had known what we were trying to do. And so we were arrested the very first day, and we went to jail, I guess, that Saturday afternoon. We stayed there till probably Sunday afternoon, and nobody got all panic about it. We got our bond, went over to Fisk, had a big rally that night, and got ready for some more action. And I think if you look at the people who came out of the Nashville movement as individual persons who had gone on to continue the movement or done other things that were connected to the empowerment of black people, you'll find probably a larger percentage of those of us who were in Nashville got involved in other areas of the movement, either with SNCC or with SCLC, a few people, I guess, with CORE, and then others, who are now elected officials around the country who are doing things in their own way in the community. I think we had a broader base. That's not to say others didn't, but I found when we went to Raleigh, for instance, we took, I don't know, 5 or 6 carloads of people over to Raleigh from Tennessee. And I guess the students from Nashville were sort of looked at as ones who we ought to talk to about how they did some things. And I just feel that we were better prepared at the moment to do that organization and not any other way. Well, you never know what people are going to do. I mean, even though we're going through these dry runs, in the church somewhere or somebody's house, it wasn't a real live situation where white folks and police officers are on your case. I guess most of us, if we were to admit it, were probably scared to death as to what was going to happen there, but we knew we had to do it, that it had to happen. And so once you get into it, then everything else just sort of just happens. You don't even think about what the next steps are, except you try to remember when we were in Orange County when, white people would try to throw you off and then cops would come in and drag you and beat on you as you were arrested, being taken to jail, to have 25 or 30 people cramped into one paddy wagon, to some extent was frightening as to what the hell was going to happen to you. So I guess that if we were to admit it, it was rather a frightening thing internally, but we didn't show that. We just went about our business, and after it happened to you sometime, it just you sort of just say, well, this is what you got to do, and you go forward to do it. Well, I guess that's the only thing we knew in the sense that I grew up in the South, and I knew that white people were tough. They didn't mess around, and that from a law enforcement point of view, they had all the control of the guns and the police officers and the courts and everything else. And I guess you just come to the conclusion in this instance, in this situation, if you're going to participate in this way, you don't come out anyway by getting up and knocking somebody down. I mean, you can do that, but at that time we were trying to, I guess, give a certain image that students could mobilize themselves, could organize themselves, and they could do it in what's, I guess, generally described as a peaceful, nonviolent manner. Plus, a lot of us didn't know about the other options that maybe were around that could even possibly be used at that time. Well, I can't remember all of it. We got there. A lot of us were excited about going because we knew there were other students around the country we had heard about. We had seen them on television or we had talked to them on the telephone and trying to hook up coordination about certain weekend movements and things. We didn't know who they were. They knew who we were. So just, and then plus to get out of Nashville. I mean, we had been battling in Nashville since the early part of February. I mean, every weekend we were demonstrating and some weekends at night, and some nights during the week we had a number of night marches downtown, and so I guess we were in battle. And one was to get out of Nashville just to take a break for that weekend. It was the Easter weekend, and also to meet all these students we had heard about and had seen. And so when we got there, it was like we had not known each other, but we all came together and we introduced ourselves as we went around, the campus at Shaw University. And plus, Dr. King was there, and a lot of us had a lot of respect for him, and some of us had been able to see him at various rallies or had participated in some affairs with him. So to be there, and a number of other people we hadn't seen, just heard about, people in Birmingham and in Montgomery and in North Carolina or in South Carolina or in Orangeburg, who had gone through hell, probably much more than we had gone through in terms of the white folks in the jails. It was just good to come together. That was one thing. The other thing was that Dr. King was trying to I guess convince students they ought to become part of SCLC. And I mean it was said by a number of people. A lot of the SCLC organizers were there. I think I remember Y.T. Walker and a lot of other people around that I can't remember now were there. And students decided that they didn't want to necessarily make that move in that way. So a lot of caucusing going on among various delegations. The Nashville group was caucusing with the Alabama group, and the Alabama group was caucusing with the Georgia group. And so I think over a period of time, certain groups sort of, like for instance, the Nashville group became very close to the Atlanta group. I guess there were a lot of similarities in Atlanta. Well, the rally, as I said, it was a coming together, and that was a basic inclination on the part of the students to sort of have their own organization or have our own organization, because one, we didn't understand all the other things that were going. I didn't understand all of the other things that were going on with SCLC and with CORE and NAACP and all these other things that were happening. And the Nashville students were probably more insistent on this than most about keeping an organization of students coming together, coordinating our efforts. Also, there was an effort made to try to get students to start doing the same thing everywhere, and we were quick to point out that each situation was different. That what we could do in Nashville maybe could not be done in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or because in Mississippi was unheard of. When we went to Raleigh in 1960, I doubt if we had hardly anybody there from Mississippi, because Mississippi was just considered one of those states where students know other people without really demonstrate. There were a few from Tougaloo, because Tougaloo had always been a campus where people had done things. There were a few there, I think, from Russ College, but by and large, Mississippi was not that well represented at the conference. Then there was a whole question too of nonviolent direct action, what that meant. And Jim Lawson was like the foremost proponent of the philosophical construct around nonviolent direct action. I think most of us were doing it it was a tactic. I know I never felt any real deep philosophical sense that we ought to do it this way, except that was the best way at the time to do it. And so I could argue that and feel comfortable with it. I think that's what most students were too. They didn't have the best way. Well, that's all we knew. I mean, well, as I said, go back to it. None of us, or those of us in the South particularly, who had faced all the power, either subtle or not so subtle power of the white power structure, knew even in those days. I didn't think that you could organize anything violent. On the other hand, I think we were dissatisfied with the slow pace of the legal route that the NAACP had done about as much as they could, I guess. But that had been a very slow process. That the Brown decision had not accomplished very much from where we could see it in the South. Also, it didn't deal with public accommodations and didn't deal with voter registration. It didn't get at the kind of things that we were very, very much concerned about. And so we didn't think the legal way was any way of getting it done. Plus, it it seemed to have moved the country to have these thousands of students marching, demonstrating, being put in jail, in some instances being beaten with national publicity on it. And so we thought that was what was necessary at that time. I couldn't think of any other way, and I don't think there were other students around. Now, there were subsequent times in the movement when there was a big debate about whether you ought to be nonviolent, you ought to be defensively violent, or you ought to do this or do that. I mean, that was a natural outgrowth of that kind of movement. But it was just exciting, and it made you feel good to see hundreds of students from all over the country, but particularly in the South, black students too, who were ready to mobilize themselves and ready to just demonstrate and to stay out of school and to face expulsion, particularly from the state schools. Well, actually, I wasn't supposed to be elected in the sense that we had decided that if Diane Nash wanted to be nominated for coordinator, for chair, whatever the leadership structure would be, that's what we would do. And I was sort of like the second or third person in that whole configuration. And we had the final meeting of the coordinating committee, or the meeting to discuss the continuation committee. That's what it really was. And for whatever reason or other, Diane was not there. And so the Nashville people knew that I was the second person that ought to be talked about. But moreover, we had made a lot of friends with people in Atlanta and the Carolinas had a large delegation of people from up and down the Carolinas because it was close by. Plus, they were doing a lot of things, and so someone, I think Virginia Thornton from Virginia, made the motion that I be the temporary chair, and it was second, and there was no debate about it, and so I was named a temporary chair of the temporary coordinating committee of the temporary student nonviolent coordinating committee. That's what it was. I mean, students didn't want anything permanent. It was temporary, and we agreed to meet 1 month later in Atlanta to talk about how we began to organize and structure that organization. And we met in Atlanta. I continued until the fall of 1960. At that time, I went to the University of Kansas. First of all, I was out of the movement daily 'cause I couldn't get back and forth into it. And secondly, the whole structure at that point was to try to find a full-time chair, someone who would take off and sort of really direct their attentions and energies to be in the full-time chair of the organization. In between that time, I had gone to both the national conventions of the Republican Party, which was held here in Washington, and the Democratic Party in Los Angeles. Bernard Lee and I had done that during the summer to try to generate some support for the movement at that time. So it wasn't the only conscious effort I think that we made was the Nashville students were determined to be wherever leadership was, we were going to be in there because we thought we had a good movement and we thought we had something to offer the other parts of the movement. I think SCLC, quite frankly, lent us or gave us some amount of money. I don't know whether it was $2,000. Mrs. Ella Baker was very involved with that process. When we first went to Atlanta in May of 1960, I think we met over on Morehouse campus or someplace in Atlanta University Center. And at that time, we decided we ought to stay in Atlanta and we ought to look for an office in Atlanta. And Mrs. Baker, I think, persuaded the SCLC people to let us use space above their office. I think it was at 208 Auburn Avenue. These numbers and streets sort of slipped me, but we were over there for a while, and we finally had some other people. I think it was Jan Stembridge and some others who knew some other people who gave us $100 here, $50 here, or $25 until we just were able to put together some little amount of money. Now, what we did in terms of people getting to Atlanta, each of the movements paid, like for instance, the Nashville movement paid my way, to Atlanta, and the other movements paid the students' way to Atlanta and paid our way back, and also gave us, I guess, um, $5 or $10 to spend on food while we were there. So the movements themselves had to sustain, our subsistence or our existence. And then I think we moved over to 197 and a half Auburn Avenue. But money started coming in the fall, particularly with NSA, the National Student Association, got very busy to assist in raising money. We had activities on college campuses in the north that sent money south to students, and that began to form a little kitty. I remember when we went to Los Angeles, we had to Bernard and I just had to hustle the money from various places to get to Los Angeles. We went on a train and we got there. And once we got there, some people there, some churches helped us to raise some money to get us to Washington. So we managed to fly over to Washington. But it was just that kind of struggle of asking people to give some money whenever they could. And then the local movements themselves had raised money because most of us had fundraising activities, had rallies where we took up money. We asked churches to send us money. They took up monies on Sundays, and the community contributed to bail bonds and things. In some instances, the bond was returned, so therefore the money was available. But it was really rough. Some of us, including myself, was a little leery of those who were advocating, let's now turn the movement into a movement for voter registration. At that time, 61, could we finally compromise, we would have had two things going. Those persons who wanted to participate in voter registration would be in that wing of SNCC, and those of us who wanted to do direct action would be in the direct action wing. And so that's where the money question of foundations came into being to some extent. And there were some people who wanted to try to get money directly to SNCC from foundations, and I think the foundations resisted that. And I guess this whole notion of the voter education project became a viable kind of alternative place for monies to go. I don't know a lot about it, quite frankly, at the time because I was not interested that much in the voter registration part of it, and the foundation part of it. I was interested in direct action. But I later learned, looking back and talking to people, how some of that happened. Because we didn't, I'm speaking for myself. I didn't understand the structure of the Justice Department and the FBI and the Attorney General and all that. I didn't understand all that. And so even with the direct action side of what we were doing, we wanted to get the Attorney General and the Justice Department in to try to protect our lives because we were in these tough situations. And but I now understand, after in retrospect, that there was a major effort on the part of the Field Foundation, the Cone Foundation, to put money into voter registration. That the Kennedys had, friends and influence in those foundations, and that there may have been some other kinds of agendas that were there that I didn't know about. And I don't think the people who were really genuinely pushing for voter registration knew about it. I mean, I think our division and our tug of war was around just whether or not we ought to keep direct action going, because I think it was effective, and we all thought it was effective, and whether or not voter registration was going to be just as effective. And I guess we all came to an accommodation that both ought to go on, that both could be effective, that both could supplement each other, that in some cities or counties, voter registration could be a good way to get activities started that will then maybe flow over into direct action around public accommodations. I think that it's obvious that they were probably trying to expand their base in the early '60s because, as you know, John Kennedy won the presidency by a very narrow margin in '60, and I think they were trying to expand it in the South because I think black people would probably more than likely be more natural allies of that group of philosophical political thought than some white people in some other parts of the country. Plus, looking in retrospect, voter registration was a motherhood, kind of issue. Who could legitimately say black folks shouldn't be allowed to register to vote? I mean, that's what you couldn't defend that, even though you didn't agree with that. So I think it was one of those motherhood issues that also satisfied some other political agendas. But the time it happened, I know I wasn't aware of that ramification of it. I mean, I was just busy about trying to get the movement going and trying to do that which I thought was right to do, for black people. And I didn't know about these other agendas. I mean, I learned about these things as you travel around the country, as you go to meetings, as you get more sophisticated about what was happening back in those days. I think most of us were very naive about the political ramifications of all this. We were just busy trying to work hard to change the damn system. What finally happened after the debates had gone down as to what we ought to do, all of us participated in trying to plan voter registration drives, even though we had some difficulties with them, and vice versa. Those persons in SNCC who wanted to do voter registration also helped us to plan direct action kind of campaigns aimed at public accommodation because we all loved each other. We all were in the struggle together. So after we had our big debates and our big fights that went on all night and half the day and half the next day, and we finally came to an agreement. We still helped each other try to plan what we could do